In 1974, a retired grain elevator worker in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, lived on $9 a week for groceries. He ate the same pot of cabbage borscht every other night for 4 years straight. His neighbor said the man looked healthier at 80 than most people at 60. That meal is number 23 on this list. He learned it from his Ukrainian grandmother who homesteaded outside Yorkton in 1903. Number 17 cost less than $1.25 to make. Number 8 was invented by Maritime fishermen who had nothing but a cod head and a bag of potatoes. These 25 meals were not fancy. They were Canadian. They were built for people eating alone at kitchen tables that used to seat 8. People stretching a pension check across 30 days and hoping the math held. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten Canadian one-pot meals for seniors living alone. Number 25, soupe au pois. In Quebec, this was not soup. This was identity. French-Canadian settlers brought dried yellow peas across the Atlantic in the 1600s, and for the next 400 years, those peas simmered in cast-iron pots on every farmhouse stove from Gaspé to Gatineau. A bag of dried peas, a chunk of salt pork, an onion, a carrot, and water. That was the whole recipe. You soaked the peas overnight, dropped everything into a pot the next morning, and let it simmer for 3 hours until the peas dissolved into a thick golden porridge, and the salt pork gave up every trace of smoky richness it had. The finished soup was so thick, a wooden spoon could stand upright in the center. For a senior living alone, a single pot lasted 5 days. A bag of yellow split peas cost $2.49 at the grocery store and weighed enough to make 2 full batches. Quebecers called each other pea soupers because of this dish. That was not an insult. That was heritage. Your grandmother served it on Fridays because the church said no meat, and the peas said you would not go hungry either way. Number 24, Maritime hodgepodge. Every August in Nova Scotia, when the first new potatoes came out of the ground, grandmothers made hodgepodge. Baby potatoes, green beans, yellow wax beans, fresh peas, baby carrots all dropped into a pot of boiling water and cooked until just tender. Then cream, butter, salt, and pepper. That was it. No stock, no thickener. The starch from the potatoes did all the work. This dish goes back to the 1800s, when settlers planted kitchen gardens along the Fundy shore. For a senior with a small garden plot, hodgepodge was the reward for a summer of watering and weeding. Every vegetable you grew went into one pot. A bowl cost almost nothing when the garden was giving. And for a person eating alone, it was proof the season had been worth the effort. Number 23, Prairie cabbage borscht. A grain elevator worker in Moose Jaw learned this from a woman who crossed an ocean with nothing but a trunk and a sack of beet seeds. Ukrainian grandmothers on the prairies made borscht the way other people breathed. A head of cabbage, a few beets, potatoes, an onion, a can of tomatoes, and a ham bone if you had one. Everything went into the biggest pot in the kitchen and simmered until the house smelled like a root cellar in the best possible way. Mennonite families from the Volga region, who arrived in Manitoba in the 1870s, made a different version without beets, using sauerkraut or fresh cabbage and a handful of dill. Both versions cost less than $3 for a pot that fed one person for nearly a week. The beets turned the broth a deep crimson. The cabbage turned silky. The potatoes broke apart and thickened everything into something between soup and stew. For a senior with stiff hands, there was almost no fine knife work. Cabbage could be torn. Beets could be grated on the large holes. Potatoes could be broken with a fork. This was a meal that did not punish you for getting old. Number 22, Newfoundland Jigs Dinner. On Sundays in Newfoundland, the whole meal went into one pot. Salt beef, turnip, cabbage, carrots, potatoes, and a pudding bag filled with split peas were tied shut and dropped into the boiling water. The peas pudding cooked in the same broth, absorbing that salty, beefy flavor until it turned into a dense golden cake you sliced and buttered. The name came from Jigs, a comic strip character who longed for corned beef and cabbage. Salt beef cost $4.99 a pound at the butcher in St. John's in the 1980s, but a single piece flavored enough broth for 3 days. For a senior living alone in an outport community, Jigs dinner was Sunday, the meal that said the week had a rhythm, and you were still part of it. Number 21. Habitant pork and bean pot. In Quebec, baked beans were not a side dish. They were supper. White navy beans soaked overnight, then slow cooked in a heavy pot with salt pork, onion, molasses, maple syrup, and dry mustard. The pot went into the oven on Saturday morning and came out Saturday night, 8 hours later, with the beans dark and sticky and sweet and the pork falling apart into tender shreds. The maple syrup was the difference between these and every other version of baked beans on the continent. It gave them a distinctly Canadian sweetness that brown sugar could never match. Habitant brand canned this recipe and sold it in every grocery store from Halifax to Vancouver for decades. A can cost $1.89 in 1995, but the homemade version, the real version, cost less per serving and tasted like the difference between a letter and a phone call. For a senior living alone, the Saturday bean pot was a ritual that anchored the whole weekend. Number 20. Lumber Camp Beanhole Beans. In the Ottawa Valley and across northern Ontario, lumber camp cooks fed 50 men 3 times a day using nothing but cast iron and fire. Beanhole beans were the workhorse. A deep pot filled with dried white beans, salt pork, onion, and molasses was buried in a pit of hot coals and left overnight. By morning, the beans had turned creamy and dark, cooked low and slow by the dying heat of the fire itself. No stove, no electricity, just gravity and patience. Lumber camps in the 1890s served this with fresh baked bread and black tea strong enough to strip paint. A cook named Archie Breton at a camp near Pembroke was said to make 80 loaves of bread a day to go alongside his bean pots. For a senior with a slow cooker, the same recipe worked perfectly. Dried beans, a bit of pork, an onion, and 10 hours on low. The slow cooker was the modern bean hole. The result was the same. A pot of beans that lasted all week and asked nothing of you but time. Number 19. Salmon chowder. On the West Coast, canned salmon was not a compromise. It was pantry gold. The ingredients were a can of pink salmon, a diced potato, an onion, milk, butter, and salt. You simmered the potato and onion until soft, added the salmon with its juice, then poured in the milk and butter. In 20 minutes, you had a bowl that tasted like the Pacific Northwest. British Columbia families kept canned salmon the way Prairie families kept canned tomatoes, always stocked. A can cost $2.99, and the soft bones inside were pure calcium. Your grandmother did not read the label. She just knew it was good and cheap. That was enough. Number 18. Bannock stew. Indigenous communities across Canada made bannock for generations before European contact, and the stews that accompanied it were as varied as the land itself. In Manitoba, Cree families made wild game stew with moose or venison, root vegetables, and bannock torn into pieces and dropped right into the pot to thicken the broth. The bannock absorbed the rich, gamey liquid and turned soft and dumpling-like. On reserves in northern Ontario and across the territories, this was winter survival food in the most literal sense. But bannock stew was also something more. It was a gathering meal. Families cooked it over open fires, in community halls, at powwows, and around kitchen tables. The simplicity of flour and water and whatever meat the season provided was not poverty. It was a tradition that colonial policies actively tried to erase through residential schools that banned indigenous foods and forced children to eat institutional meals instead. For a senior living alone, bannock stew connected to a food memory that predated every European recipe on this list, and that connection mattered. Number 17, sea paille. In the Saguenay and along the lower St. Lawrence, families made sea pie for Christmas and New Year's. Layers of pastry alternated with layers of cubed meat, wild game, potatoes, and onion, all stacked in a deep pot and covered with a pastry lid. Then the pot was slowly baked for hours until the layers melted together into something between a stew and a pie. The name may come from 6 pates, which means 6 pastry layers. Some families used rabbit, some used moose. A sea paille cost almost nothing if you had your own flour and your own game, which most Saguenay families did until the 1970s. For a senior living alone, a scaled-down sea paille could fill a small Dutch oven and last a week. Every serving was different depending on which layer you scooped from. That variety from a single pot was precious when you were cooking for one. Number 16, potato and leek soup. Scottish immigrants who settled Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia in the 1800s brought this recipe across the Atlantic with them. Wild leeks grew along the ditches and forest edges every spring, and for families who had almost nothing, free food growing on the roadside was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. You sliced the leeks, diced the potatoes, and simmered them in water with butter until everything was soft, then mashed it roughly in the pot. Some added milk, some kept it plain. The result was a pale green soup that tasted like spring itself, mild and sweet with a faint onion warmth that sat gently on the stomach. A pot cost less than $1.50 when the leeks were free. For a senior with a weak appetite, this was one of the few soups gentle enough to eat when nothing else appealed. It asked nothing of the body. It was soft, it was warm, and it went down easy. Generations of Cape Breton grandmothers knew this was the meal you made for someone who was fading, not as medicine, as comfort. Number 15, Saskatchewan beef and barley stew. On the prairies, beef was cheap and winters were long. A pound of stewing beef, a cup of pearl barley, carrots, onion, potato, and a can of tomatoes. Everything simmered for 2 hours until the barley swelled and the beef turned fork tender. Pearl barley cost 89 cents a bag in the 1980s, and it stretched a small amount of meat into something that filled you for hours. Farm wives in the Capelli Valley made this every week between October and April. For a senior on a fixed income, a pound of stewing beef costing $3.99 plus a bag of barley made a pot that lasted 4 days, less than $1 a meal. The arithmetic worked on the prairies. Pause for 1 second. Number 14, Creton's pot. Creton's was the poor man's pâté of Quebec. Ground pork cooked slowly in a pot with onion, milk-soaked breadcrumbs, clove, cinnamon, and a pinch of allspice until the mixture broke down into a spreadable, deeply seasoned paste. It was traditionally made in large batches and stored in crocks or jars, eaten cold on toast for breakfast, lunch, or a late-night snack. The spices, clove and cinnamon in particular, gave Creton's a warmth that no other cold meat spread in Canada could match. A pound of ground pork cost $1.99 in the 1990s and made enough Cretons to last 2 weeks. Your grandmother in Trois-Rivières kept a crock of it in the icebox at all times. For a senior living alone, Creton's was the meal that did not require cooking at all. Spread it on bread, pour a cup of tea, and supper was served. No pot to wash, no stove to turn on, no energy spent. That ease mattered on the days when standing at the counter felt like climbing a hill. Number 13, canned salmon and rice pot. A can of salmon, a cup of white rice, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and enough water to cook the rice. Everything went into one pot. 20 minutes later, you had a meal that tasted like a simplified version of a West Coast casserole, creamy and rich and faintly pink from the salmon. The cream of mushroom soup did the same work in Canadian kitchens that it did everywhere else on the continent. It turned simple ingredients into something that tasted finished. For a senior living alone in a small apartment in Winnipeg, Edmonton, or Thunder Bay, this was a Thursday night staple. No fresh ingredients needed, no trip to the store, just the pantry and 20 minutes. A church food bank volunteer named Helen in Red Deer, Alberta, packed this exact combination into hampers every December. She said it was the meal that seniors told her they actually made, not the fancy recipes on the pamphlets. This one. Because it worked. Number 12. Nova Scotia fish chowder. Along the South Shore, fish chowder was not a restaurant appetizer. It was the meal itself. Fresh haddock or cod, potatoes, onion, salt pork for rendering, milk, and butter. You fried the salt pork until the fat rendered out, cooked the onion in the drippings, added cubed potato and water, simmered until tender, then laid the fish fillets on top and let them poach in the steam. A pour of milk and a knob of butter finished it. The whole process took 30 minutes. In Lunenburg, fishing families made this with whatever the boats brought in that morning. Now here is something that matters. A bowl of fish chowder made from fresh haddock at a Halifax restaurant costs $14 to $18. The same bowl made at home with a single fillet from the fish counter costs about $3. The restaurant adds presentation and ambiance. The home version adds memory and quiet. For a senior eating alone, the quiet was not a deficit. It was the space where the taste actually reached you, free from the noise of a dining room full of strangers. Cooking for one was not sad. It was private. There is a difference. Number 11. Tourtière stew. Traditional tourtière was a pie, but the filling was always a stew. Ground pork cooked with diced potato, onion, clove, cinnamon, and nutmeg. When your hands were too stiff to roll pastry, you skipped the crust and ate the filling from the pot. In Quebec families, this was the quiet adaptation no one talked about. Grandmothers who had made tourtière every Christmas for 50 years eventually reached a winter when the pastry was too much, so they made the stew. Same spices, same warmth. A batch cost less than $5 and lasted 3 days. The clove and cinnamon filled the kitchen with a smell so specific that anyone from a Quebec household would recognize it blindfolded. For a senior living alone, that smell was company enough. Number 10. Manitoba wild rice soup. Wild rice is not actually rice. It is a grass seed harvested from shallow lakes across Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. Indigenous communities harvested it for centuries before settlers arrived. The recipe was simple. 1 cup of wild rice, chicken broth, a diced onion, celery, carrots, and a splash of cream at the end. The rice took 45 minutes to cook, but it split open into long dark grains with a nutty, almost smoky flavor that turned plain broth into something extraordinary. In Winnipeg, wild rice soup was on the menu at every church basement supper and community hall fundraiser from the 1960s through the 1990s. A bag of wild rice cost $4.99 and lasted through 6 or 7 batches of soup. For a senior, the cost per serving was pennies. The nutrition was real. Wild rice is high in protein, low in fat, and packed with fiber. Your grandmother did not know the numbers. She just knew the soup was good, and the rice kept in the cupboard forever. Number 9. Pea soup with salt pork. This was the working man's version of soup au pois, stripped down even further. No carrot, no onion, just yellow split peas, a chunk of salt pork, water, and thyme. 3 hours on low heat. and the peas turned into a thick porridge that stuck to your ribs and held you through a 12-hour shift in a factory, a mill, or a mine. Salt pork was the cheapest meat in Canada for 100 years. It cost less than $2 a pound in the 1980s because nobody wanted it except the people who needed it most. The tradition went back to the lumber camps, the rail gangs, and the fishing stages of Newfoundland, where salt pork and peas were the two things that never spoiled and always filled you up. For a senior living alone, this was not a recipe, it was a reflex. Soak the peas, drop in the pork, walk away. Come back when the kitchen smells ready. No measuring, no watching, no standing. The soup made itself. That was the whole point. Number 8. Cape Breton stovies. Scottish immigrants who settled Cape Breton in the early 1800s brought stovies across the ocean. Leftover roast meat, sliced potatoes, onion, and beef dripping. Everything layered in a pot and cooked slowly until the potatoes broke down, and the dripping gave everything a richness butter alone could never match. In Scotland, stovies were the Monday meal, built from Sunday's leftovers. In Cape Breton, they became the meal that used whatever was in the icebox before it turned. For a senior on a small pension, nothing went to waste. The heel of a roast, 2 soft potatoes, half an onion, into the pot. Margaret MacNeil in Glace Bay made stovies every Monday for 40 years after her husband died in the mines. Her daughter said the kitchen smelled the same every Monday until the day Margaret passed. Some meals are not about food. They are about keeping time. Number 7. Alberta Ranch Stew, a hearty working meal. On cattle ranches across southern Alberta, the cook made one meal that could feed hired hands at noon and warm up for supper without losing a thing. Chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, turnip, onion, and a can of tomatoes went into a heavy pot. Sometimes a splash of beer, if the hands had been drinking the night before and there were half-finished bottles on the porch. The stew cooked all morning while the men worked the cattle, and by the time they came in, the kitchen smelled like everything good about the West. Beef cost next to nothing on a working ranch. The vegetables came from the garden or the root cellar. The whole pot was essentially free. For a senior who once worked those ranches and now lived alone in a small house in Lethbridge or Medicine Hat, making this stew was not cooking. It was going home. The smell of beef, tomato, and turnip simmering together carried more memory than a photograph album. Now here is the truth about cooking for one that nobody talks about. The food industry spends millions telling seniors that cooking is too hard, too dangerous, too much trouble. Buy the frozen dinner, order the meal kit, call the delivery service. A frozen dinner costs $5.99 and contains more sodium than a full day's worth of meals. A pot of ranch stew costs $4.50 and lasts 4 days. That is $1.12 a meal versus $5.99 a meal. The economics are not complicated. They are designed to keep people dependent on products instead of skills. Every senior who makes a pot of stew is an act of rebellion against an industry that profits from helplessness. Number 6. Canned corned beef boil-up. In Newfoundland, a boil-up was not a method, it was a way of life. A can of corned beef, cabbage, potatoes, turnip, carrots, and sometimes a few dumplings made from flour and water. Everything boiled in one pot until the vegetables were soft and the corned beef broke apart into salty, beefy shreds that flavored the entire broth. A can of corned beef cost $3.49 and contained enough meat to season a pot that fed one person for 3 days. In outport communities along the northern peninsula, this was a staple when fresh meat was unavailable, which was most of the winter. The canned corned beef sat on the pantry shelf for years without going bad, waiting for the day you needed it. For a senior living alone in a Newfoundland winter, with snow piled to the windowsill and the road not plowed until morning, that shelf was security. You did not need to go anywhere. The meal was already there. Number 5. Ontario Loyalist Chicken Pot. After the American Revolution, United Empire Loyalists fled north to Ontario and brought their one-pot cooking traditions with them. It used simple ingredients: chicken, potatoes, onion, turnip, and a handful of dried herbs from the kitchen garden, all simmered in a heavy iron pot over a hearth fire. The recipe survived 2 centuries because it never needed updating. A whole chicken at a Canadian grocery store cost $8.99 in the 1990s, and it made enough stew for 6 days of meals. You could stretch it even further by adding more potatoes. Loyalist families in the Kingston and Belleville area passed this recipe from mother to daughter the way they passed land deeds. It was property. It was worth something. For a senior living alone, a single chicken in a pot was the most economical meal in the country. The bones made broth the next day. The broth made soup the day after that. 3 meals from one bird. Nothing wasted. That was Loyalist arithmetic, and it still works today. Number 4. Mennonite Farmer Sausage and Potato Pot. In southern Manitoba, Mennonite communities made farmer sausage, a smoked pork sausage seasoned with pepper and garlic that tasted like nothing else in the Canadian grocery store. You sliced it into thick coins, added potatoes, onion, and enough water to cover everything, then simmered it for 30 minutes. The sausage released its smoky fat into the broth, and the potatoes absorbed every drop. No spices needed, no seasoning besides salt. The sausage did all the work. In Steinbach, Winkler, and Altona, this was the Wednesday night meal that every household made without consulting a recipe. Farmer sausage cost $3.99 a ring at the local butcher, and it kept in the refrigerator for weeks. For a senior, the beauty was the simplicity: 2 ingredients and water. No measuring, no technique, no recipe card. Just the memory of how your mother made it, and the knowledge that it would taste the same as it always had. That consistency mattered. When everything else changed, the sausage and potato pot stayed exactly where it was. Number 3. Red River Cereal Porridge Soup. This one will surprise you. Red River cereal, that blend of cracked wheat, rye, and flax that sat in every Canadian pantry from the 1920s to the 1990s, was not just breakfast. Prairie grandmothers made a savory version by cooking it in chicken broth instead of water, adding a diced onion and whatever leftover vegetables were in the fridge. The flax thickened the broth into a silky soup, and the cracked grains gave it a nutty texture that rice could not match. A box cost $3.49 and lasted a month. Doctors in Saskatoon quietly recommended it to patients with digestive concerns decades before the fiber trend reached the rest of the continent. For a senior living alone, this was the meal that came from the breakfast cupboard on a night when the pantry seemed empty. Canadian resourcefulness was not about having enough. It was about knowing what to do when you did not. Number 2. Church Basement Hamburger Soup. Every United Church and Anglican parish hall in Canada served this between 1950 and 1990. Ground beef browned in the bottom of a stock pot, then a can of tomatoes, diced potatoes, carrots, celery, onion, a handful of barley, and enough water to fill the pot. It simmered for an hour and fed 40 people for the cost of one restaurant meal today. The church ladies in Brandon, Manitoba, Truro, Nova Scotia, and Sudbury, Ontario all made the same soup without ever comparing recipes. The recipe lived in the collective memory of women who fed their communities without recognition. A home-sized batch cost $4 in ingredients and lasted a senior 5 full days. For a person eating alone, making hamburger soup was an act of faith. Faith that the effort was worth it, even when no one else would taste it. faith that feeding yourself well was not selfish. It was necessary. Here is what nobody says out loud. Cooking for yourself is one of the last acts of true independence a person has. When you stop cooking, something fundamental shifts. The kitchen goes quiet. The stove goes cold. And a part of you that knew how to take care of things starts to disappear. These meals were built to prevent that disappearance. Not because they were exciting, but because they were possible. You could make them tired. You could make them lonely. You could make them with hands that ached, and a back that protested, and a kitchen that had not been properly cleaned in a week. They met you where you were. That was their purpose. Not flavor profiles, not presentation. Dignity. Number 1. Chicken and dumpling pot. A whole chicken simmered in a pot of water with carrots, celery, onion, and salt. It simmered for 2 hours until the kitchen smelled the way every Canadian kitchen used to smell on Sunday afternoon. The broth turned golden, and the chicken fell apart. Then spoonfuls of biscuit dough were dropped into the simmering liquid, and the pot was covered for 15 minutes. The dumplings puffed up soft and pillowy, absorbing the chicken flavor as they cooked. When the lid was lifted, the steam that escaped smelled like someone's grandmother still lived in the house. This meal crossed every province, every culture, every income level. English families in Ontario made it. French families in Quebec made it. Mennonite families on the prairies made it. Indigenous families in the north made it, with wild fowl and bannock dumplings. A whole chicken cost $8.99 at any Canadian grocery store, and this recipe stretched it into 5 days of meals. The bones made broth the next day. The broth made soup the day after that. The dumplings were flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and milk pennies. Every church basement supper from 1950 to 1990 served some version of this. The women who made it never wrote the recipe down because they did not need to. It lived in muscle memory, in the way the dough felt between the fingers, in the sound of the pot at a low simmer. For a senior living alone, a pot of chicken and dumplings was not just nutrition. It was proof that the kitchen still worked, that the hands still knew what to do, that the simple act of feeding yourself was still an act of love, even when there was nobody else at the table to notice. Now, I am not a doctor or a dietitian. This is not medical advice. Make one of these this week. Just one. The cabbage borscht, the salmon chowder, the church basement hamburger soup. Spend $4. Put a pot on the stove. Then sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place for yourself. Use a real bowl. Eat it slow. Because these meals were never just about being cheap. They were about staying alive and staying whole when the world made it simple to stop trying. A retired teacher in Fredericton told her daughter that making fish chowder every Friday was the reason she still felt like herself at 86. Not the fish, not the chowder. The act of making it. Share which one you are going to make in the comments. Tell me if the Jig's dinner gets more love than the pea soup. Tell me if anyone else's grandmother kept a crock of croutons in the icebox the way families in Trois-Rivières did. That grain elevator worker in Moose Jaw did not survive on cabbage borscht because it was gourmet. He survived because he refused to stop cooking. These are not just meals. They are proof that the simplest food, made in one pot, eaten alone at a Canadian kitchen table, can still be an act of dignity.